So we want this to be a pretty interactive and collaborative conversation. At TINYpulse, we like to keep things tiny, we say. So I just figured we'd have an intimate conversation with 150 of our closest friends. And please use Slido. And if you have questions, please, I'll get my phone out and I'll keep an eye out for those questions. If I can weave them into the conversation, I will. If not, we'll save about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So let's get started. Ben, I wanted to kick off with you. So when we talked last week, you made the statement that you said when you came into the county of San Mateo, that the plane had already taken off, and you were tasked with fixing it while it was in flight. So talk to us about how you started building a system around TINYpulse that you could implement at your organization. How did you do it? Where did you start? What were some of the tiny wins? And what were some of those tiny challenges? And then Anna and Kate, I'd love to hear how you guys have done the same thing at your organizations.
Yeah, people hear me? All right, cool. So like Cody said, the big thing for me with TINYpulse is that it was part of something larger. And that's for our county. I'm running a pilot program to eliminate annual evaluations and do this whole continuous coaching, feedback loop, all the rage. And that's where I came into the position. The position had been created to run this pilot program. The pilot program started off with 2 goals. One was eliminate annual evaluations, which is like pretty easy. We just decide, boom, they're gone. The second goal was do pulse surveys with a 80% response rate. So that was the goal that was set. That was like the initial proposal that was approved by our executive board. So kind of really had to hit the ground running, or as Cody said, we were building the plane while flying it, which created a lot of tiny challenges and not so tiny challenges. But I think for us, where it's worked really well is that TINYpulse is part of that larger feedback loop, that it isn't just an isolated survey that disappears into people's inboxes and that a supervisor reads once and then it goes away, but they never do anything. Because it's part of this larger thing that we're trying to do, this initiative, we're able to connect the dots. So we're doing lots of work with having our supervisors have one-on-one check-in conversations, having more longer-term goal discussions. Recognition was one thing we really wanted to do, and that's where Cheers for Peers, that's been probably by far our biggest win. People love Cheers for Peers, way more than I realized they would. Which has been really great to see. And then the other thing I'll say is, just for that response rate goal that I set, a little over a year in, and we're there. So we have, for the county, about an average of overall, over the whole year, there's been some dips and some higher points, about an 80% response rate, which we can maybe get into a little later about some of the things we've done around that. But I think the big thing that I tell the departments when we're adding them in is we only hit that goal because we set it. That if we hadn't set that goal at the outset, that this matters, that we need the high response rate, if this data is going to mean anything, that was what allowed us to get there. But, and I was scared, I was scared about that goal when I started. I saw that 80% and I was like, we'll see how that goes. But yeah, really setting those aggressive goals. There's been lots of great little wins along the way, as well as the cheers. Just my favorite one that I still mention is a compost bin. And it was the littlest thing, but it was just to me, a perfect example of, we got a suggestion, it came through that in an employee break room, there should be a compost bin. Sustainability is one of our organizational values. It's a big value in California and Washington in general. So it was just a good example of kind of like, here's a discrete thing, which has yes, we can add the compost bin. It's a doable thing. Compost bin don't cost a ton of money. And it's also the sort of thing that wouldn't otherwise really get in front of leadership. Like, there aren't really clear channels for that sort of thing to go up, for that feedback to go upstream. So that was, to me, one of the really cool early wins that we had.
Yeah, that's awesome. So one of the things that you mentioned is response rate, and I think that's something that everybody looks at and that everybody wants to measure against. And it's we get a lot of questions around response rate. Anna, you made a statement that Cheers for Peers has been a big driver of your guys' response rate. And the other thing I think all three of you done is that even though TINYpulse is anonymous, you guys aren't afraid to encourage people to continually respond and educate people. So talk to us a little bit about the impact Cheers for Peers has had on response rates and a couple of the other initiatives that you've taken to promote the high response rate.
Absolutely, yeah. So Cheers for Peers has been really big with our company. We've got about 800 employees, between 760 and 800 who engage in TINYpulse, and they're spread out over 4 states. So it's been really tricky to make our employees who are in clinics all over, California, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, to make them feel like they're part of one company, which they are, of course. And that was one of the big reasons that we started pushing TINYpulse. And one of the big ways that we've been able to make, a physical therapy aid in a clinic in Oregon feel like someone in admin is paying attention to them is someone in HR sends them a cheer and says, hey, I just noticed you had a great comments are anonymous. A great Cheers for Peers for somebody else. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate that you're using this function, you're using this feature. The other thing is, because I work in HR and I deal with a lot of new employees, it's like a really tangible way that I can just shoot off a Cheers for Peers. I just had a conversation with a new employee about benefits. And I can send them a cheers and say, it was so great getting to know you. I can't wait to interact with you more, answer any of your questions, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. So Cheers for Peers has been really huge. The other thing is it's a really great tool for supervisors, and just making supervisors and directors aware. This is actually a really fabulous and uplifting thing that you can do to get your employees feeling not only appreciated but involved. We sent out an email to our directors for our company, and the next week I noticed that one director had sent out 80 Cheers for Peers to like 5 clinics. I was like, whoa, he really took it to the max there. But that was just like a really tangible example of a way that as a director and a supervisor, it doesn't take much work to just shoot off a Cheers for Peers when you're answering a survey. Our company does do weekly surveys. And because we've got about 800 employees and they're all over the place, we don't have such an enviable response rate. Ours is more at like 40%. We definitely are thinking about ways we can get more employee engagement. One of the ways is like utilizing Onboard, which is a segment that allows you to send off surveys to new employees specifically regarding their new employee experience. It's been really valuable for our company. We really enjoy it. And it's a way that you can get things started. Like, this is part of their onboarding experience, their new hire experience. TINYpulse is part of our company culture, and we value your feedback. So using that has been really helpful. The other big thing has been using metrics. So there's a lot of reporting opportunities with TINYpulse. You can divide into segments, and you can kind of compare participation for different areas. In one of the certification classes, they were mentioning how a little bit of competition can sometimes be healthy. So seeing the different participation in different areas under different supervisors is actually kind of healthy, because then you can be like, hey, I know that you guys are super busy and you've got a ton on your plate, but you have like a 10% participation rate with TINYpulse. What are some strategic ways you can kind of get more feedback and encourage the people underneath you to respond more often? So that's been really helpful.
And Kate, you had some supervisors who were, they had great participation and they were really adopting TINYpulse, and you had some who were not as eager to join. But then once they saw some of the low scores, then they became more engaged. So talk to us about how you kind of fostered the environment to get leadership more involved in TINYpulse and to really engage with the tool and interact with employees.
Yeah, so we actually took a very phased approach in implementing TINYpulse. So back in the winter time, when I recently started, we wanted to build a stronger culture of listening. And so we evaluated multiple survey tools, and TINYpulse came out as the winner based on our feature requirements. With that, I knew I had partners within the organization that were influential leaders, and I partnered with them to pilot this tool just to get some data. Because I think when you whet the appetite of the executive leadership and show them the value of the feedback, then they start getting interested, and then they can start thinking about, okay, well, maybe I should invest in something like this. So once we piloted, we went through a reorg. So between that time, the pilot and when we actually rolled it out, we paused for a bit. But once we rolled it out, you know, I sit within one of the business units within Xbox. There are 6 business units. And we just rolled it out within just one business unit because the approach that I found works really well within this organization is you start small and then you start getting the tiny wins, right? And then you start telling this, then you can tell the story. And then people will, their ears will perk up because they're starting to see the data and the numbers and the value. But within our business unit, there are 3 managers that lead the 3 teams, and they're all on different parts of the culture journey, right? There's one that's banging down my door every Thursday to get the data. Like, I want to see the verbatims. I really want to see it, and I want to do something about it. And then there are some managers that'll take a look at it. Good to know. That's what I thought, and then just moved on. But I think you just have to work with wherever they're at, meet them where they're at. And I think when they get to a certain point, they will care, because I had one manager who did not really do much with the data. It took 4 months of looking at the weekly results, and we asked, after 4 months, we asked, have you seen any change in the culture since we've started collecting feedback? And for his team, the answer was, the score was really low. And I think that got his attention. So when he started caring, he actually started meeting with the team and asking, why do you feel this way? I'm going to show you the results of all of the TINYpulse results. And as a result of that, one of the wins was the employees took it upon themselves to do something about the culture. Yeah. So they created a mystery lunch, a weekly mystery lunch, because they felt like, oh, I had no idea that we had all these issues within our team, but now that we're sharing this data, I get to do something about it.
And they would just get random people together and go to lunch?
Yes. He started a program because he didn't realize that there were employees within this team that didn't feel connected with their peers. And he wouldn't have known that if this manager didn't share the data. So awesome. The importance of a share back is so important. But you know, I have a manager that shares back every week, and he will say, this is what I heard, this is what I've learned, and here's what I can do about it, and this is what I will do. And so the participation rate of that team is very high, but then you have some managers that are slower on the journey, but they are still, you know, learning and becoming more aware of how they can play an active role in driving culture.
That's awesome. I think that goes back to the Pulse framework that David shared, and also I think it showed up in the TINYcon or Tiny certification, that, you know, when you share and evangelize, you know, the S and the E is really what can help drive that response rate and get employees to keep wanting to give you that information. Real quick, a question came in, I think it's on topic, so I'm going to ask. Anybody feel free to jump on this one. When only one segment of an organization uses TINYpulse, how do you engage executives that do not use it to help move suggestions and feedback to wins? And maybe just to piggyback off that, how do you, get some of those other segments that you might be wanting to adopt TINYpulse more? How do you get them to really take movement on it in approaching leadership?
I think that if you don't have leadership that is on board with this, I mean, you can administrate TINYpulse all you want, but until leadership is kind of sold on this is a worthwhile thing, you probably won't get them to go anywhere. So it would be, if they're even interested, one of the things that I do, I don't drive the culture of my company. I'm very much an administrator. I'm very much someone who's just in the reports all the time. But like what Kate was saying earlier, when they start getting some feedback and like, this is how it's working for this person who's using it, and this is the feedback he's getting, and this is the participation he's getting. So if I could really help you. I could make this smooth. I could send you reports, once a month with the participation and all of that. If you kind of, that's been my role, is selling it to like my COO and my CFO. Just kind of giving them a reasonable game plan for getting this data and getting this feedback and getting them sold on the idea, then they can promote it. But it definitely takes effort.
And our circumstance is a little unique because I went a little bit rogue with rolling out TINYpulse. In my role, I sit in the business, and so we have HR partners, but sometimes it seems like we're working against each other when we really need to be partnering together. But with Microsoft being such a huge company, it's a huge HR department as well, and so they already have established listening systems. And so when you're talking with HR about adopting this new third-party TINYpulse survey system, they're going to initially say no. It's not. We already have our systems. We don't need anything else. You should be using your internal tools. Yeah. But thankfully, I had a manager, and our leadership was very supportive of trying something new. And we're all about having that growth mindset. It's learning. Let's try this out. If it fails, then we know. But we won't know until we try. And so, thankfully, we were able to pilot this. And as we were, continually pulsing our employees, our HR director, she realized, okay, so our annual pulse, they get 80% response rate, which is amazing. But then their random pulse that gets sent to employees randomly, they get a very abysmal response rate. And so she started to see, after a few months of this data, or hearing about TINYpulse, that she saw the opportunity to supplement her listening systems with what TINYpulse was offering. And so with that, I hooked her in. So now I have an HR partner, and she has the ear of our EVP and the rest of his directs and our VPs. And so once she was on board, we were able, it was a lot more smooth sailing in getting the senior leadership to buy in and be on board with the rollout of a third-party tool.
Great, that's awesome. And Anna, you mentioned that as far as getting feedback to people who may not be in the tool as much as you are. For your onboarding data, you'll take that report from the onboarding feedback and you'll walk it over to recruiting and training and hand it to them.
Yeah.
And make them look at it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's one way that is you just open up the lines of communication and take it to them and have the conversation.
Well, I think one of the most empowering things that TINYpulse has done, it sounds so nerdy, but you can download reports with all the data. And so the fact that I can just take the data, take the pulse surveys, the comments, the cheers, and download that, make it functional, make it readable, make it something that my COO, my CFO, the CEO can look at and take in 10 minutes, rather than logging onto a website and trying to scroll through pages and pages. This has made it really tangible for them, and it's something that doesn't take me long. So I can go to onboard and get the onboard responses for all of our new employees and send that to our director of development and our recruiter. And they have instant feedback right there, and it took me all of 5 minutes. And I can do the same thing for weekly Engage surveys, all those comments. And then if there are specific suggestions, I'm this administrative person who just says, that suggestion looks like it needs to go to our HR director. That suggestion looks like it needs to go to tech support. And I can shoot them off to the different directors who can actually make a difference. And then from there, the trick is following up and actually being able to respond to them and saying, look, tech support actually helped you out. They reached out to you. This is a win. But yeah. Awesome,
yeah. So Ben, I think you're verging on celebrity status here with your 80% response rate.
I shouldn't have given that away.
It's fairly consistent in the questions here. So let's double click there for a minute, because I think one of the things that I took away from our conversation is that 450 people in TINYpulse, 12 departments, but each department has a liaison.
Yes.
And they'll get competitive at times.
Yes.
And then you guys have also done animated videos, you've done newsletters, like you talk about the importance of feedback and response rates, or getting employees to respond a lot. Tell us more about your strategies and what has worked, what hasn't, and if you could say do these 3 things, what would they be?
Yes. Let me work through some things before I get to the 3 concise tips. So first, there's been a lot of communication, which is good for me because my background is in marketing and communication, so that was kind of an easy fit. But it was also something that we didn't do enough of at the start. Like really, we kind of realized after the rollout, after the first few months, we didn't do enough. So kind of going off of one thing Anna was saying is like we had one department that had pretty low. They were more, or I guess to us they were low. They're more like the normal, like 40, 50%. They were down there, and we were like, hey, what's going on? Everyone else seems to really be liking this surveys. What's happening? And it just took me going out and giving a presentation and talking with all of their supervisors to explain the why, because that had been missed, and that's something that I think, as much as I try in PDFs and emails, is really hard to convey just through text or even cute clip art. You really kind of need that conversation, because that's, for me, that's what TINYpulse, that's what this performance system we're trying to do is all about, the conversation. So we should probably actually have a conversation about it. In terms of other things so as part of that, we made like a whole video, which was just kind of silly and cute and a little different for the county, because we wanted to stand out from the standard government, very generic communications. I just actually finished up doing a whole little like PDF onboarding guide, which again, very low on the text, very high on bright colors and big bold words, trying to make it easy for people. But the other thing, as Andrew was talking about the onboarding data, that's been something that I've ended up spending a lot more time on than I had anticipated at the beginning, is I end up actually, I export all of the engaged data, and then I've started trying to build out our own dashboards, a lot of internal reporting things of what we do with that. And I was actually just talking with the Tableau folks earlier, and I'm sure they do a much prettier job of it than I do. But that's been one thing, and that like the biggest thing in those reports is that competition. So this was one of the things with just how the reports are set up in TINYpulse, is it wasn't for us easy enough to compare segments. So I wanted to have a very clear, HR department, this is how you're doing, this is how the rest of the county is doing. And that's a very, like, that was what clicked for folks, is that direct comparison that was felt a lot more real than I personally liked the industry and overall TINYpulse benchmarks. I think they're interesting, but what drove action was that more direct competition with other people in the county. And then also, the Cheers has definitely really driven our response rate a lot. Again, the last thing is just that, again, this is not an isolated thing. We are using TINYpulse as part of this larger performance management pilot. This larger performance management pilot is part of a larger engagement initiative that the county has been doing for probably a decade. And that's, maybe I would like to take credit, but I really can't take full credit for that response rate, because that was something they've been building year after year of doing these annual engagement surveys, explaining to people why it matters. People still didn't believe they were anonymous, so I had to do some work there. That's a challenge. But that it was just, it's building on top of this. And that would be I guess my number one advice is like, don't treat TINYpulse as a check the box, now we've solved employee culture. That it really, you have to do something with it. You have to figure out what actions are supervisors taking with the feedback, which was also about getting the feedback down to a more local level. That it didn't really help us drive things to just know, like, here is for our department of 200 people. Well, that could be any number of things factoring in. We can't tell what to do with that information. So we've done a lot of work on how we set up our filters within TINYpulse. Very excited for more local controls to be rolling out so that it isn't all on me. But that's, I would say, I'm just gonna go with number one tip. Don't treat TINYpulse like an isolated thing.
Very good. And Kate, sometimes an impact of response rates that people cite to us is that they spend a lot of time having to reassure people that it's anonymous. Do you get that much at Microsoft? And do you, it specifically said they find themselves banging their head against the wall telling people that it is anonymous, right? So how have you guys rolled out that communication and provided the reassurance to employees that it is anonymous and that you actually do want the nitty gritty? Because you really rely on the verbatim responses that you get.
To be honest, we're still figuring that out, because we're working with developers and techies, and so they're thinking, well, gosh, you could really track this through the IP, so I'm not going to give my anonymous feedback. So I think that's one of the challenges that we have. Our response rate hovers around 40–45%. I'd love to see that go up. But I think one thing to keep in mind is I think different people want to give feedback in various ways. So maybe it's not an anonymous survey isn't the best way. Sometimes they want to just go direct. But for those that are worried about the anonymity, one thing, we are very conservative when it comes to protecting anonymity. My VP actually has a lot of concern with us responding to the verbatims. Because even though it's anonymous and I don't know who I'm talking to, just the fact that I responded and someone's sending me responding back to me makes me a little nervous as an anonymous feedback giver. So we want to respect that, and so that's one way we're trying to let people know, reassure people that it is anonymous by kind of not responding. But I would love to continue to explore additional ways to tackle that. But one of the great ideas that came out of our certification was someone mentioned, actually showing someone the admin dashboard so that they can see that it's all anonymous. I think that would be a great way for us to reassure our employees that the feedback is indeed anonymous.
Yeah, and we always try to reassure people too, or we tell people when you're responding to a private message to reiterate that it is anonymous and you don't know who they are, so that people have that comfort. Yeah. So, the other thing is we talk about response rates. It gets mentioned a lot, and it's part of this conversation here. And Anna, you're 40%. Kate, you said you're around 40%, and then we all know that Ben's a bit higher. But
regret saying it.
But a lot of times people feel like if they're not achieving a really high response rate, that it's somehow bad, right? And it's not, because even though you guys are at 40%, there's no shortage of ability for you to get the feedback, identify themes, and make huge impacts for the employee experience, right?
Right, absolutely.
And so, how do you guys handle that with leadership that might be saying, well, I want more response rates or high response rates? Like, what's that conversation like? How do you communicate to them that you're getting very valuable information that can and will make an impact?
I don't even have to tell them that, because they're so overwhelmed with the data that they get. The verbatims are so honest and direct that they're just really focused on the feedback. Mm-hmm. No manager has actually come to me to say, I want more feedback, because I already have a lot of feedback to work with. But I think it's really right now helping our managers to really focus on identifying the meaningful action in response to the verbatims. That's kind of the stage that we're at. We're between, in terms of the Pulse framework maturation model that you showed today, we're in between 1 and 2, where we have this feedback frenzy, but we're moving towards having that fruitful action. And I think we do have that, but it's not yet consistent where it's sustainable. But it's definitely something that, when we do have wins, we want to be more intentional about sharing that and celebrating that and publicizing it with our employees.
Right. And speaking of leadership and how to get them involved, and part of the equation, you've done a good job of getting your leadership team and executive team to maybe they don't log into the tool and respond to feedback, but they'll tell you what to say, and you've also got them to send cheers.
Yeah.
How did you go about doing that?
Well, that was fun. I am fortunate because I work for a company that, kind of what you were saying, growth mindset, right? However, showing tangibly, these are the benefits of what you can get if you're encouraging the people underneath you to respond. The benefits include higher employee satisfaction rate, and we ask the question, how happy are you at work, fairly frequently, and obviously every supervisor wants to see that their employees are happy at work. Like that's a big deal. That's kind of the driving force of this employee engagement in this culture. So being able to show a supervisor tangibly, the people underneath you are quite happy because you're obviously encouraging their participation and you're listening to them. Being able to show that tangibly to one, and then being able to say kind of tangibly to another one, hey, look at the results that this area is getting because they're encouraging so much feedback. Your results are not quite as positive, and you could have those potentially with just a little bit of effort on your part. And there's lots of different strategies and lots of different articles on the TINYpulse website to do that. I think every supervisor, every director wants to have that insight into what are the people beneath me really thinking, what are they really feeling. So being able to give them a tool to read that, and just being able to say, it's really not as much work as you think, I think that's the big deterrent, is they think, this is gonna take a ton of my time, and I have way more stuff to do. I can't focus on this. Being able to show them, hey, look, it takes me 5 minutes to download this. I can clean it up for you and give it to you, and it'll take you 15 minutes, maybe every 2 weeks, maybe every month, however often you do your survey, and you get a direct pulse into what the people beneath you are thinking. That's really valuable. I mean, I don't think very many supervisors are going to turn that down. It's just a matter of presenting it to them in a way that's kind of clear and straightforward.
Yeah, great, thank you. So two rapid fire questions that I think each of you could answer really quickly. We'll start with the first one. How often do each of you pulse? What's your pulsing cadence? Weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? Weekly?
Weekly.
Weekly?
I'm split. It's going to change a little bit, but about half our people are weekly, half are every other week.
Great. And then how often do you guys use a custom question or an open text question?
Once a month? Once a month.
I use custom questions a lot because people like to be able to customize them. Open-ended, I probably do like once a quarter-ish.
We just rolled out 4 new accounts today, actually.
Congratulations.
And now that all business units are on TINYpulse, we actually have to work with our HR folks to make sure that the questions that are asked are fully vetted. So we ask a lot of custom questions now. We get it from our HR team. But previous to that, I think 3 out of 4 times I use the bank questions. Yeah.
Great, that's awesome. So we're going to move to true Q&A here. If anybody has questions, please put them through Slido. Another question I'll ask all of you that came up, and maybe you could just give your top tip, is when you're first getting started and you're kind of in that feedback frenzy mode where it's just like, holy cow, like that's a lot of information.